Thank you so much for that nice welcome. So, what I'd like to talk about today is basically something that you're all familiar with, from being a child, from being a parent, or perhaps, as even my case right now, being a grandparent, and that's school buses. So, as with any successful research project of any magnitude, no one person does it by himself. And so these are my colleagues on the left side at Auburn, and the right side is one past student who now is at Mary State, and then a current doctoral student. So probably nobody had a disclaimer today, did they? So it's kind of weird, but I'm going to give you a disclaimer. Not only that, I'm going to give it to you twice, once now and once at the end. And so it's important to realize that school buses, I use different colors, are by far the safest means to transport students in the United States. So none of this is meant to be an indictment of the school bus industry or anything like that. But I think perhaps even though it's a safe media, we might be able to go a little further. And so that's what I'm here to see today. So if we look at this and we go back to Bluebird number 1 in 1927, 3 major school bus manufacturers in the United States, Navistar, Thomas Built, Bluebird. About maybe 3 decades ago, there was about 20 in the United States, and they've all boiled down to 3 big ones. So if we look back, while you're looking at those, essentially we started with a device that would transport children from point A to point B and do so in a safe manner. And so while we see a lot more technology and style and aerodynamics, the basic mission of the bus hasn't changed for almost the last century. So I'm going to wave a magic wand. You guys will all be engineers. Congratulations. It's good or not. And actually in Rapid City, it's a great place to be an engineer. And what do engineers do? We use science and math to solve problems. We are problem solvers. And since you're engineers, you like numbers, so I'll give you a few. In the United States, school buses travel billions of miles on the road every year. They transport millions of students, 25 to 26 million students daily in the United States. There are hundreds of thousands of school buses of what we consider these large Type D school buses in the U.S. fleet, about 480,000 to 500,000. If we go to tens of thousands, there's about 26,000 school bus accidents per year. Most of those are very, very, very small and really somewhat inconsequential. Very rarely do we have major incidences, and when we do, they're pretty highly publicized. Approximately, we have about 100 fatalities a year that are associated with bus accidents, school buses. Most of those occur to the occupants of the other vehicle, not the bus. And then finally, and perhaps the most important number that we'll talk about today, is in the single digits. On the average year, we see between 5 and 10 students become fatalities a year by means of this transportation. So we ask ourselves, why are these so safe? They're safe for a lot of reasons, right? Their visibility, they're big, they're very big, they're very high off the ground. So most of the accidents that occur are underridden, meaning the vehicles that are involved basically go under the actual compartment of the bus and down in the chassis area. They actually have a trademark registered color. Nobody else in the United States can use that distinctive color of yellow with the exception of school buses. And they have a lot of warning systems using a lot of modalities. Those are kind of the physical traits. On the other side, there are probably the most definitive characteristic is very, very well-trained and motivated workforce with school bus drivers. They are have a high oversight, mostly from the school district and the state. There's federal motor vehicle safety standards. They're well maintained, and then they also operate at predictable times. You know, we are very well aware to be extra cautious in the morning on bus routes and again in the afternoon. So you put all those factors in there, and perhaps these are some of the reasons that buses do have this envious safety record. So from my perspective as an engineer and yours and as a researcher, I see 5 major safety issues right now with the school bus community. They're not in any particular order. Number 1 is this struck by, which is passing vehicles. And so about half of those fatalities that I told you about, between the 6 to 10 that we have almost every year, are when children are either entering or leaving the bus, typically crossing the road, and a motorist passes the stop arm, and it ends up in a very, very serious injury or fatality. Seatbelts are a fairly big issue around the nation right now. There's a handful of states that mandate seatbelts to be installed on the bus. After a certain time period, there is no federal standard on this. The National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, NHTSA, is currently looking at whether we should have a national standard on this. Special education transport is its own issues and comes with some hard things that we have to deal with when we transport special ed students. I think the things that we're seeing in the school system, unfortunately, are going to eventually work their way to school buses, and I would classify this as domestic terrorism. And I think this is something that the nation needs to think about right now before we have an adverse event. And then finally, what I want to talk to you today is evacuation, and I want to talk about evacuation not in a normal upright configuration, but if something other than that occurs. So, even as safe as they are, and with all these safety systems, it is possible for school buses to have adverse outcomes, and we do see those. And so these are some fairly recent ones, and I just particularly picked these because to show you that there are many areas of the bus that can be impacted, and a lot of times this can also deal with the evacuation system, and so then it has to become ad hoc on the fly. And so buses can end up in other than a normal orientation. And also remember, so we were talking earlier about engineers and being problem solvers and designers, and so it's very important for us when we design to consider the intended use population over the life cycle of whatever it is we're designing, in this case the bus. So as often the time, I can't tell you about Rapid City in South Dakota, but certainly in Auburn, Alabama, we have schools that start at varying times so we can use the same buses, the same bus fleet. And so we will have actually kindergarten exclusive routes, and we might have K through 2 and then, K through 5, these type of things. So it's appropriate to talk about the upright orientation first because that's where we are by far the vast majority of the time. So what I want to say to you is, when I flew up here a couple of days ago, I flew in a small aircraft that held about 52 people. And so in the United States, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, mandates that before a manufacturer can put an airframe in service, the manufacturer has to demonstrate a full-scale evacuation in 90 seconds or less. Passengers all have to be in the seated position, belted in. Same thing for crew. They say start. Last person's feet has to be on the ground in 90 seconds. If that happens, it gets certified. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't, and they get to try again. We have no analogous evacuation standard for buses. So certainly we can agree that evacuation from a plane is not really applicable unless we're taxiing on the runway or sitting at the gate, right? And it's functioning kind of as a big geometric tube that transports passengers. So I contend to you, Jerry and friends, I don't see a big difference between a cylindrical geometric tube that transports closely seated passengers from point A to point B and a rectangular metallic aluminum tube that transports closely seated passengers from point A to point B, with one possible exception. I told you briefly that if your airline seats 44 or more passengers, you have to pass that test. Many of these school buses can seat up to 90 or 92 children, depending on the size of the occupants. So it's possible, it's not only possible, it's definitive that in the United States right now, we can have up to 90 passengers in a closely related geometric tube, but there is no standard that says they have to get out in 90 seconds or less. And I'm here to tell you today, I think this is a problem. Because we know definitively that fire can propagate and burn out the entire inside of a school bus in as little as 3 minutes. As little as 3 minutes. So I say to myself, self, we want children to jump, small youngsters, kindergartners, to come to the back of a bus. It's about what? What does that slide say? So it's about 3.5 feet, and a child that age is about 3 foot 9 inches. So we think about their eyes. So here they are. This is about 3 feet from a calibrated shoe I took earlier. And we're going to ask a child to do that, and a lot of times they're very fearful of this, so they even teach them to sit and scoot. And while that's good from an injury perspective, it certainly lengthens the evacuation time. We can agree on that. So if I asked an adult, an average male adult, to do the same thing, that person would have to put their feet at 5 foot 3 inches. So you know where their eyes are. Their eyes are about 10.5 feet over a basketball rim, and then we say jump. How many would jump? Not many. So I guess on the fly, we need to look at the evacuation system as a whole, and again, including those youngest occupants. So I just want to talk to you about some work that we've done for the past few years with our research team. We conducted and published one of the first full-scale evacuation studies in the United States, where we grabbed approximately 500 students. We did front door evacuation only, rear door evacuation only, both doors simultaneously, and then we did all those combinations with and without driver assistance. And we see what we're interested in the evacuation world from a human factors perspective is flow rates. It's how quick can we get people from a point to another point through a restricted area. In this case, the doors is what we're talking about right now. And so that data and those 2 points up top, that it says kindergarten, one is without the driver assistance and one is with the driver assistance. So again, this is not a definitive study. It has limitations. It's a fairly small number of subjects. But remember I told you 90 seconds, so if you draw a vertical line at 90 seconds, most of this student performance exceeds that. And what we're talking about right now is the normal upright condition. The bus is not on fire, there's no toxins, there's no smoke. This is as good as it's going to get. And so if we look at first grade, second grade, and third grade, we see the same type of pattern, and we use these flow rates, as I'll talk to you about in a second. So again, not to be self-serving, but our mission as academics is to do this research and try to inform the scientific community so that designs can be influenced and perhaps regulatory change can come about. So now we have the vertical upright position. Let's quickly talk about the rollover position. And so as it turns out, there is a large number of aspects in the emergency evacuation system in buses, not just the rear door, but the hatches and the windows and the other components that are actually designed for adults based on size, strength, and stature, and do not consider the youngest occupants. And so if a bus rolls over, that rear door, those hatches, present themselves in significantly different orientations and attitudes, and now they have to be a viable exit for these young folks, and there has been hardly any research on this, and so this is a big issue. So it started out, I wanted a whole bus. They said they'd give it to me. I thought they were kidding, and they said, really, you can take the whole bus? And I said, no, I can't take the whole bus. So they gave me the back end of a bus. Bluebird was more than happy to do this for us. And I was so excited with this until I found out that I had to rent a flatbed and a forklift because it weighs about 2,500 pounds every time I wanted to move, and it cost me $1,500. I wasn't happy anymore. So being the kind of people we are, we not only like math and numbers and science, we like to take things apart and break things to figure out how they work. So I called the fire department and said, hey, cut this thing up, and we want to build these evacuation devices, and they were more than happy to do that. And so you'll see, so when we do our research, we start with real bus parts, and then we mock up these test devices. And so you'll see, actually, I'll just spend 1 second showing you this. It might be hard for you to see, but you see that little girl on the right-hand side. That rear row of seats actually impedes the exit door significantly. And so back in the article, we could look it up, and I could tell you exactly. I think it's like 42%. And that's a little bit of an issue when it's upright, but it's not that much of an issue because there's still an aisle. But when the bus goes into the adverse orientation, it becomes a major issue because not only do you have to climb over that, it also has standoff distance because it's not just attached to the back, it's kind of at a little bit of an angle. And so the other thing you should note here is you see if the bus rolls over with the driver down, that hinge on the rear emergency door is up. So gravity wants to do what? It wants to swing that door shut. And I'm here to tell you that door weighs about 90 pounds. So when we test children, it's very, very hard to get Institutional Review Board, IRB permission to test children. Anybody in here that's a researcher knows that. And so we have to take a lot of precautions with the personal protective equipment. We had to tie the door open. We had to pull the mats. I agree that that adds limitations to the study, but when there's no evacuation data out there, you have to do what you have to do to get this data. We did the same thing with a roof hatch, and so when we test these youngsters and they're standing on that window, which has been removed and put in by a piece of plywood, that's actually what they're faced with in a rollover, and as it turns out, I'll show you in a second, the midpoint of that hatch is well over their head. And so a lot of these youngsters don't have the upper body strength to be able to successfully evacuate via that hatch. So we did this study with a psychology professor, and on that hatch has a little knob and it says turn and then push. So we tested all the physical characteristics of the K through 3 students. The psychologist tested their knowledge of evacuation words and comprehension and could they recognize the words emergency. And then she had them role play or act out what they would do. So she asked them, if I tell you to turn and push, and she showed them the picture, the actual hatch, show me what you would do. Do you know what they did? Can you guess? Yeah, it's funny, but you know what? It's not funny. Because at that level of cognition, and if we don't have an adult there, because a lot of times when the buses have incidents, the driver is disabled. That's one of the primary reasons for having the event. And so you can imagine, you flash back in your own memory, if you're on a bus route that perhaps is isolated and we have a problem, we could have 30 to 40 to 50 youngsters in a bus facing not only an accident, a rollover, but a fire or toxins or smoke or anything like that. And we have to say to ourselves, what are they going to do? And so, there's a tactical process to this and there's a strategic process. Tactically, we've addressed those things, and you can look at those while I'm talking for a second. The big thing on a strategic view, we've invested about 5 years in this right now, and where we're going with this is we're going to try to take this data, work with the 3 major school bus manufacturers and the government, state and federal, to perhaps influence evacuation design and regulatory aspects. The second thing we'd like to do is we'd like to take our data and subsequent data and use that in evacuation models so that we can simulate this and actually predict the probability of escape and test different designs and then fatalities that are associated with this. And then lastly, we hope to make a difference in the future on this. We can't analyze everything, right? And so typically in safety engineering and risk analysis, we have to look at things that are, anything's conceivable. You agree? Anything's conceivable. We can only analyze credible things and try to apply the engineering design process to that. We believe this is a credible event. Thank you.